Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast.
Hey, Adapters. Welcome back to a truly exciting episode. In this podcast, we explore ManglarIA, which means AI for mangroves in Spanish, an innovative project from World Wildlife Fund, supported by Google.org. This pioneering initiative is harnessing advanced technology, including artificial intelligence, to assess how climate change is impacting mangrove ecosystems and the vital support these ecosystems provide for coastal adaptation. First off, you'll hear from AI experts from WWF and Google.org. Then you'll take a journey with me to the Yucatán in Mexico, where we'll visit remote crocodile-filled mangrove forests alongside staff from WWF Mexico. You'll discover how they're using cutting-edge sensors and drones to gather essential data and how AI is playing a key role in helping adaptation planning. We'll also hear directly from local community members who are participating in and benefiting from this remarkable project. This episode celebrates WWF's forward-thinking work to adapt our natural systems to a changing climate. Okay, let's join Sean Martin of World Wildlife Fund as we journey to Mexico and learn the value of mangroves for coastal adaptation. Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Sean Martin. Sean is Vice President for Climate Change Adaptation at World Wildlife Fund. Hi, Sean. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you, Doug. It's great to be back.
It's always a treat to have you on. Sean, I have you back to talk about a new WWF project called ManglarIA, looking at mangroves adaptation and artificial intelligence. Can you give us some details about the project and what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, sure. Your listeners may have remembered in a previous episode that we talked about how WWF is conserving mangroves around the world to contribute to our conservation efforts. And one of the things that we talked about in that episode was how it's really important to understand how climate change is affecting natural systems like mangroves. And this project, ManglarIA, is a great step forward in helping us to understand how climate change is affecting mangrove ecosystems. Now, just as a reminder, mangroves are those coastal forests found in tropical countries. They're really good at storing carbon. They protect coastlines from storm surge and coastal erosion, and they're really important for local economies. And so it's really important that we save them. But we really don't understand how mangroves are responding to changes in climate and weather. For example, which sites are best suited for restoration given all these changing environmental conditions? And really importantly, we're trying to save mangroves to store carbon to contribute to our climate change mitigation goals, but we don't really know how things like extreme weather, heat, lack of rainfall affects mangroves' ability to store carbon. But to answer these questions, we need a lot of data. And many times we just don't have this data, particularly in tropical countries. What we're doing with ManglarIA is we're installing lots of sensors to collect the data that we need in 2 mangrove ecosystems in biosphere reserves in Mexico, one in the Yucatan Peninsula and one on the Pacific coast. And once we have all these massive data sets, we really need AI to help us find patterns in the data to answer our research questions. And we've decided to look at several things. First and foremost is how climate change is affecting the extent and the health of the mangrove ecosystems. And then we're looking at 3 ecosystem services. We're looking at how well mangroves actually protect coastlines as tropical storms continue to get stronger. The second thing we're researching is how changing water temperatures and water chemistry is affecting fish populations that live in mangroves, particularly those that are most important for local communities. And the last thing we're looking at is how extreme heat, changes in precipitation, salinity of the water that mangroves are in, change their ability to store carbon, which is really important because we're relying on those mangroves to help us achieve our climate change mitigation goals.
Why are they such a focus for conservation efforts in places like the Yucatan?
So mangroves are really important in Mexico and places like the Yucatan. Conservation groups like WWF are using mangroves as nature-based solutions, in this case, to help address the climate crisis. So we count on mangroves for carbon and coastal protection. But for people living in and around those ecosystems, they're really important for their livelihoods. Fisheries depend on mangrove ecosystems. They're nurseries for fish. And increasingly, local communities are relying on mangroves for tourism. So while WWF is trying to preserve the biodiversity in mangrove ecosystems and all the species that live there, as well as using mangroves as nature-based solutions to address the climate crisis. Local communities really depend on them for their livelihood, something that we often don't appreciate much here in the United States.
Who are you working with there?
Yeah, WWF, of course, can't do this alone. So we're working with government agencies like CONABIO, which is a national commission that looks at the use and knowledge of biodiversity. We're also working with universities like the National Autonomous University of Mexico, the Autonomous University of Nayarit, and research institutions like Cinvestav. We're also working with the Technological Institute of Sonora. And really importantly, we're working with the local communities that live and depend on the mangrove ecosystems where we're conducting the research.
You talked about the partners you're working with in Mexico, including the communities living around the two biosphere reserves. So what role are the community members playing in the project?
Thanks for that question. The communities are really important to the project's success. We're relying on these communities to help install the sensors that I referred to and maintain them and collect data from the sensors. And the other important thing is, in addition to collecting the data from the sensors, we're really relying on the people who live there for their on-the-ground observations, what they're noticing when they go out into the mangroves, to ground truth the data that we're collecting from the sensors. And this, when we use AI to answer some of our research questions, we will check the accuracy of what we're learning through AI with what the communities are telling us are actually happening. And it's just really good to have the communities involved and that they actually benefit from the project as well. We're installing lots of weather stations in those two biosphere reserve, and we're actually giving these to community members so that we can collect the data that we need on the weather, but they're actually using the weather stations for their own livelihoods. And later on in the episode, we'll hear from them and the innovative ways that they're using these weather stations. So it's really important to get the community engaged. We need their help, but they also need to benefit from the project itself.
I'm going to pivot a little bit here. We've been hearing a lot about how AI is increasing the demand for energy and how that could increase carbon emissions. Are you concerned at all how this project might contribute to climate change as you're trying to better understand its effects on nature?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. And it is true that AI is increasing the demand for energy. However, it's important for your listeners to know there's different kinds of AI, and the different kinds of AI have different energy demands. All computation requires electricity, but the AI models that ManglarIA is using to analyze the data we're collecting uses considerably less energy than algorithms used for generative AI. Generative AI is when AI creates images or videos. And that's what really is driving the recent growth in data center energy demand. We're not using generative AI in ManglarIA. Our carbon footprint for ManglarIA itself should be relatively very low.
All right, we're going to hear a lot more about the fundamentals of AI in one of our next conversations. But before we get started with these other conversations, where did this idea come from? And I just want to drop that Borneo and orangutans played a role, right?
Yeah, even though this project is in Mexico, I got this idea a long time ago when I was visiting our office in Borneo, Malaysia, and we had a researcher looking at orangutans and how the orangutans' behavior was changing because the fruits and flowers that they eat were appearing at different times, and they couldn't really understand why. And I asked them, do you have weather data in this area where the orangutans are? And they said, yeah, we do. And I said, have you looked at how the weather is changing and then how that might be changing the timing of the fruits and flowers and therefore orangutan behavior? And they said, no, but that's a really good idea. So he came back, and I've always been concerned about how climate change is affecting nature. And I said, we really don't understand how climate change is affecting the things that WWF is trying to conserve. After that, I went to a workshop in Colombia that was focused on mangroves, and we asked these kinds of questions. How does increased temperature affect mangroves? Oh, we don't know. How does increased salinity of water that mangroves live in affect mangroves? Yeah, we don't know that either. Said, wow, we're trying to conserve these mangroves, and we really don't understand how climate change is affecting them. And if we don't understand that, we don't know the best ways to conserve them. So I came up with this idea. I worked with some of my partners at WWF, my colleagues, Dave Thau, who we'll hear from, and another guy, Dan Brizuela. And we came up with this idea called smart parks, where we would put weather stations in protected areas, national parks around the world, so we could start to learn some of the things that we're learning with ManglarIA. We tried to shop that around with a few donors and were unsuccessful. But in 2022, my colleague Mike McNeil reached out to me and he said, "You remember that smart parks idea you were working on?" I said, "Yeah. You really might be interested in applying for Google.org's Impact Challenge on Climate Innovation." So we did. And we submitted our idea for smart parks. And there were many entries. It was a very competitive contest. They gave 5 awards, and ManglarIA was one of them. However, what we hadn't thought of with smart parks was using AI to help us make those connections between climate change and changes in biodiversity and ecosystem services. And so that's what this generous grant from Google.org for ManglarIA is really helping us do. So that's the origin story of this. It's a 10-year idea in the making, and you can imagine I'm just thrilled that we actually are doing this now.
Very exciting. Sean, let's get this episode started. Tell us who we're going to hear from next.
So first, we're going to hear from Dave Thau. He's WWF's chief data scientist, and he's going to give us a little tutorial, a primer on AI. I assume many of your listeners are not experts in AI, like I'm not an expert in AI. And Thau is going to explain to us what AI is and how we're using it in conservation and in this project. And then we're going to hear from Bridget Hoyer-Guslink at Google.org, and she's going to talk about how Google and Google.org specifically is supporting adaptation efforts around the world with AI and other Google products. And very interesting to learn what they're doing there.
Very exciting. Okay, Sean, I'm going to check in with you a bit later.
Great. See you soon.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is David Thau. Thau is the Global Data and Technology Lead Scientist at World Wildlife Fund. Hi, Thau. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Doug. Great. Happy to be here.
We're having you on because you are an expert at WWF on artificial intelligence. Let's just get people grounded with some of the fundamentals. And it's surprisingly, probably a lot of people don't actually know what artificial intelligence is. What is it? And give us a little short history. How long has it been around?
The broadest definition, which I think is a good definition, is if it looks intelligent and a machine is doing it, it's artificial intelligence. Chess is an activity that people think you have to be pretty smart to play a good game of chess. And now we have computers that can play an amazing game of chess, and that's artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence has been around for a long time, almost as long as computers have been around. The first AI applications were in the 50s. And there are many different kinds of AI, and they've all been evolving over time. And the one that everybody hears about now is machine learning. So training machines up on lots of information and creating systems that can learn from that information. That's what things like ChatGPT run on. Machine learning is one type of AI. There are lots of other kinds of AI, some for planning, some for predicting. A lot of those don't necessarily use machine learning. They use other techniques. But the overall idea is if it looks intelligent and the machine is doing it, that's AI.
You just mentioned that a lot of this actually had been behind the scenes, but ChatGPT, which probably people are familiar with, or a lot of people, in the last couple of years, that has really made AI come front and center. And so I think that was probably just a turning point in regards to how much attention it's been getting. But it had, like you said, it's been around for a while.
That's right. And we've been using it. So it was an academic lab kind of process in the past, but in the last decade, it's been creeping into everything that we do. So if you have a cell phone and you take pictures with it, and those pictures are sorted into pets and people, that's AI. And you've been using it all along. And even things like grammar check in word processing software, that's AI too. It's gone from the lab to normal use without us really even knowing it. And then when about, 18 months ago, almost 2 years ago, when ChatGPT came out, that was a big introduction to this new kind of way of interacting, which is this conversational way. And now there's Gemini, there's Claude, there are lots of different models, and it's really having an impact on many different aspects of people's lives.
What's your personal experience with AI?
I've been working with AI for a long time. The first computer I saw was in my library when I was 14 years old. It was a teletype. It had no monitor. It was just a typewriter connected to a mainframe, and you could run programs on it. And one of the first programs was a tic-tac-toe program, which is a form of AI. This thing ran and could figure out tic-tac-toe, and it was pretty good. And once I saw that, and realized that I could write those programs myself, I just took off with it. And I've been doing AI ever since. My first paid job in college was an artificial intelligence program that was around communication. And now that I'm working in conservation, most of the work I'm doing involves AI in some way.
You already gave some examples, but I want you to give a few more. So what are some additional applications of AI that my listeners are probably familiar with that's embedded in our daily lives now?
Other places that AI is being implemented and affecting people are areas like fraud detection for credit cards. When your bank calls and says, oh, there's a suspicious looking charge, that's been using AI for a while and it continues to improve. Recommendation systems, Spotify, if it recommends music to you, that's artificial intelligence, the same with any recommendation system. Insurers use AI to determine how much it's going to cost for your insurance plan. Oh, employers are using it now to help sort through resumes to help bubble up the ones that they should be focusing on. And of course, people are using AI now to help write papers, and there's AI being used to detect which of those papers have been written by AI. So there are lots and lots of applications now, and increasingly.
What is AI good at doing, and what is it not so good at doing? Because obviously it makes mistakes, and we're learning all about that.
AI is really good at seeing patterns. If you show it a lot of information and you tell it what you're looking for, AI is very good at finding it. This is one of the cases we use in conservation, is trying to identify species in camera traps. What's it? Motion sensitive cameras. So we can show in AI lots of examples of lynx and say, that's a lynx, that's a lynx. This is a lynx. This is an ocelot. And AI is very good at learning from those examples. AI is also very good at taking in lots and lots of information, more information than a single person could take in, and processing it very quickly. So one of the main reasons we use AI is for efficiency, to make processes that take a long time happen a lot quicker. So once you train an AI to do something, you can then have many machines doing the same thing, and it just makes everything more efficient. AI is not so good when the information you're feeding it is biased in some way. So an artificial intelligence can't tell when what it's being taught is not representative of reality. So if you feed it information that's biased in some way, then the AI is going to be biased in that way, and it can't know anything about that. AI is also pretty bad about, right now it's getting better, but one of the problems is it doesn't know when it's wrong. And it's not very good at explaining itself. This is a huge area of research now. If you're interacting with an AI and it's giving you information that you don't think is right, you need to be able to have it explain why it's coming up with its conclusions. Even if you think it may be right, being able to have the AI explain why it's coming up with the information, it is challenging, and it's a very big area of research. So this AI explainability is another big one.
You've almost defined it, but you haven't mentioned the word. And so what is a hallucination in regards to AI?
So hallucination is a clever way of just saying the AI gets things wrong. But often the way it gets things wrong is it just makes stuff up. I had this, just like people Google themselves, they also AI themselves. And I asked one of the AI systems to write a biography about me, and it just put in all kinds of stuff that wasn't true. And it had no way of knowing it. And there are lots of cases like this. There are cases in law where entire cases have been made up with citations. And this is happening in science papers as well. So because these modern systems, the large language models, they call them, like ChatGPT or Gemini or Claude or many others, or Llama from Meta, those take in enormous amounts of information. They have huge amounts of knowledge that's been crawled from the web and gotten from other resources, and they can draw from this, but sometimes they just get the wrong information. So one fun thing is ask one for a biography of a person that may not be very well known and see what comes out. So those are the hallucinations. And the challenge is they're very confident. The models will give you an answer and there'll be a lot of information. So it'll seem reasonable, but often there's just misinformation in there. And so this is another big area of research now, how to minimize hallucinations. And there are lots of different techniques people are using to do that. And one is to just fact check through other repositories of information to see whether the information is true or not.
All right, so I want to give my good and bad. So the bad is just, as you described, I was doing some searching on ChatGPT on myself, and I asked about all my media appearances that I've been on, and it gave me two or three different very specific NPR appearances that I did on specific shows. And keep in mind, I've never been interviewed on NPR, and I've never been interviewed on those shows. And yet, like you said, it was so confident in saying, oh, you were on this morning show, and no, I wasn't. And then, but on the positive side, and I find it's a great brainstormer if I just have an idea and I can have this conversation back and forth. And like 95% of it is stuff that's obvious and that's not that useful. But occasionally you'll get one sentence like, oh, I didn't think about it that way. And so I love brainstorming, and it's been a great brainstorming partner. So it's a work in progress. All right. On that note, I want to pivot here. The next question is that, do we have anything to fear from AI? And again, we all think to go straight to Terminator, but what do we have to worry about?
Like any technology that's broadly adopted, it's causing changes and disruption. So there are the fears that come with any new revolutionary technology. And I think AI is a revolutionary technology. So one clear one is on jobs. There's already evidence that AI is replacing people doing specific kinds of, this has happened in the past with every big technology that's come out, and people retrain, but it's definitely disruptive. So that's a big one. Environmental impact is another one. Data centers are growing, and this is not just for artificial intelligence, but it's for all of the work that we're doing online now. The amount of electricity that they're using is growing, and AI is a large part of that. So there are environmental concerns. Those often people turn to renewables as the way to address that, okay, these systems are using more electricity, but we can reduce the carbon footprint by switching to renewables. But that's definitely a worry. And then this thing about bias and these systems reacting in ways that are biased, and we don't really see the bias. They don't, because they're not transparent. It's not obvious that the bias is there until the bias has an effect. And then we realize the models have been trained incorrectly and it can address it. But hidden bias is another big thing to fear with AI. And that can be addressed by finding the bias, realizing it's there, and addressing it. It's just something that has to be monitored all the time. And then, like any tool, it can be used for bad or it can be used for good. So the ability for these systems to generate both words and images and movies and sounds, there's a lot of opportunity for misinformation to be generated by them at a very large scale. So that's what a bad actor can do with it. And that's something that we have to definitely worry about. And the way people are addressing that is the people building the models are trying to figure out ways of inserting information into the results that will identify those results as AI generated. That may not necessarily stop a very bad actor from doing bad things, which is the case with any tool. It's the risk with AI is just how close it's starting to get to generating things that just seem very real and hard to distinguish between reality and misinformation.
I don't want you to go into too much detail here, but you recently shared a paper, and I've been thinking the implications of this could actually be pretty profound in this whole notion of AI slime. What is that all about?
AI slime is a great term. And this also feeds into something called the dead internet theory. These are ideas about how AI-generated content is growing in size, and the percentage of AI-generated content on the internet is growing. And there are questions like how much traffic on social media is AI generated, or how many websites are just AI generated websites. And I see different numbers around this, but for AI generated traffic, some statistics are like 50% of traffic on some social media companies' sites is AI generated traffic. And I recently saw an estimate in a not yet peer-reviewed paper that it was something like 50% of sentences have been translated into one or more languages, which means that a huge amount of content on the internet in multiple languages is AI generated. And there's one interesting risk, in addition to just being confronted by AI generated content all the time. There's also this issue about AI models are being trained on the content that's on the web. So the AI models are starting potentially to be trained on content that is itself AI generated. And so there's this thing called model collapse that people talk about, where AIs are being fed AI generated information. It just makes them worse over time. So that's another side of this sort of slime issue, where more and more content is coming from, not from humans, but from machines.
How are we applying AI in ManglarIA? What do we hope to learn in that process?
ManglarIA is the name of the project. ManglarIA is pun on using AI to understand mangroves. The IA at the end of ManglarIA is the Spanish artificial intelligence. And the idea is to use AI in all parts of the project to help understand how climate change related variables impact mangroves, and also not just the mangroves, but the people who depend and are impacted by the mangroves. And there are many different places that we hope to be leveraging artificial intelligence in that process. And it goes from understanding where the best places to put sensors are. So we'll be monitoring the carbon in the mangroves. We'll be monitoring the biodiversity that's there. We'll be looking at the extent of the mangroves and measuring how climate change variables impact those. And we'll be using sensors to do that. So one example is salinity. How salty is the water that the mangroves are growing in? We'll have sensors for that, and we'll be using AI to understand where to put those sensors. AI is also useful for understanding the information that comes off of the sensors. So for motion sensitive cameras, which we'll be using to understand the biodiversity in the mangroves, we'll use AI to identify species from those images, because often those images, those cameras are triggered by wind or leaves or things like that. And there's not necessarily even animals in the images, but you can use artificial intelligence to analyze all those images and pick out which ones have animals and even identify what kind of animals they are. So we'll have lots of different kinds of sensors picking up lots of different kinds of information. And we also hope to be able to use AI to integrate over those different kinds of data, to combine information about wind with our understanding about mangrove extents and the carbon that's there, and bring all these kinds of information together to extract trends and understand the impacts of things like storms on coast protection. And then finally, there's one place where it's a little bit of a, we call it stretch goal, is to really understand not just correlations like, okay, this storm had this impact on the mangrove extent, and then at the same time a fishery was impacted, to really teasing out more causal relationships. Like, how is it that a storm impacts fisheries? And there are techniques to use AI to help do that as well.
What are some other examples of how WWF is using AI in its work outside of climate change and adaptation? And you talked a little bit early at the beginning of our interview, but you have a few other examples?
Sure. We use lots of different kinds of AI in many different contexts. One application of machine learning, which we've already talked about, is analyzing satellite data. So we can get lots of good information about land cover and conservation corridors using satellite data, but the satellite data needs artificial intelligence to help process it, to understand what's forest, what's grassland, what's pasture. So there are applications of AI there. We also use AI for planning. So this is work that we did in partnership with folks at Harvard and Carnegie Mellon and University of Southern California to use AI to help us predict where wildlife snares will be. So this is a kind of a prediction system that uses planning to figure out, okay, if we have seen snares like for elephants in this place and rangers went in to remove the snares, how are the people who are putting the snares down going to change their behavior in reaction to that? And so there's a lot of artificial intelligence that's involved in that process.
Val, you've given us a wonderful grounding in artificial intelligence as part of this overall episode. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Hey, Adapters. Joining me is Bridget Hoyer-Gosselink. Bridget is the Director of Product Impact at Google.org. Hi, Bridget. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Doug. Thanks for having me.
Can you tell us briefly what Google.org is in relation to Google?
Google.org is Google's philanthropic arm. So we operate as a philanthropy within Google. We're part of the company, and we look for ways that we can bring our resources to important social issues around the world. And those are philanthropic funding. So we give away cash, a large amount of our funding from a 1% commitment we made as a company when we were founded. And then we also look for ways that we can be leveraging our technical expertise. So Googlers volunteering their time for causes, as well as our products. So giving away products like our AdWords and AdGrants products, as well as things like Google Workspace.
What do you do there as Director of Product Impact?
My team and I look after the work that we are doing to really think about how can we use the emerging technology that we're seeing, of course, across our company, across so much of the world right now, to address big global challenges. And that a big part of that is the work that we do on sustainability and climate. We do that work in partnership with lots across the company at Google and obviously lots across the ecosystem. And we're specifically thinking right now, of course, about how AI can really be accelerating solutions in that space at a time when we really need it more than ever.
For Google, what are some of those global challenges? And I'm thinking more specifically around climate adaptation.
So we have been working in climate adaptation as a company for some time. I think we especially have seen the value that technology can bring in providing new information. And with AI, we are able to better understand the world around us in ways that we never really thought possible, to process the kind of information on the global scale of the Earth and the planet in ways that allow us to better understand what's happening, to better predict what might be happening in the future, and then, of course, to act on that. So that includes work, obviously, around natural disasters, things like major flooding events, wildfires, hurricanes. We now have an ability with AI to better model out and understand those types of major events. And then obviously the sort of changing nature of coastlines, of things that cities maybe should be paying attention to, extreme heat. It's a range of things that, of course, continues to grow, unfortunately, as we see many more changes coming from climate change. But underpinning all of that is really an emphasis on where can we as a technology company and where can we as Google.org as a part of that really be bringing the technology together with people on the ground who have been working on these issues with environmental organizations, with governments, with community organizations, to be taking that kind of new information and turning it into action that allows for that adaptation to really happen, right? It's not one thing for us to have better climate understanding, but for us to really adapt and build that resilience, it's obviously going to take action. We want to make sure that action is as effective and targeted as it possibly can be.
Let's dig into that. So you guys are developing tools and technologies to help these communities adapt to climate change. And those are my listeners. My listeners are adaptation planners from all over the place. And so I'm sure some are using them today, or they need to know that they're out there. And so I've gone through the sustainability report that Google has created, and there's a section on adaptation. And can you share broadly what your approach is within that? You guys map out some of the areas, key areas.
Yeah, across the company, we are, as I mentioned, working, observing these events and thinking about how we can really bring our AI tools to bear. It is really across a range of different areas. It's a lot really thinking about how can we surface new information. So that would be things like better understanding of extreme heat, or the ways in which trees, for example, in cities are affecting heat or inequitable extreme heat events across perhaps a city landscape, all the way through to big new advances we've seen in, for example, in hurricane prediction, where we've seen new models from Google DeepMind come out this year that can really help to advance our understanding of where the paths of hurricanes are going. It gets to that prediction element, which is really important, right? If we can give adaptation planners, government agencies, folks in community organizations, and citizens themselves better information about what we might expect. Obviously, that gives us a chance to act in advance rather than after either a major crisis or kind of a major shift. And so we are putting out through our products as Google, we have a set of products called SOS Alerts, which you would get potentially on your phone through search. If you were to Google extreme heat, California, where I'm sitting, you would get information about what's going on. Those alerts we do across a range of different events. And we've been able to use that same system to put out, for example, information about flooding events. We have a major effort over the last number of years to really invest in better flood prediction. Flooding affects so many communities around the world, millions of people's livelihoods and lives. And so looking at how we can better improve flood forecasting such that now we're able to, across 80 plus countries in the world, give flood warnings up to 7 days in advance. Now, those can go both directly, as I mentioned, through our platforms, but also importantly to government agencies, to community groups. And then we as Google.org are coming alongside that. So again, as I mentioned, it's only so helpful to have these as it is that we have the capacity to act, that organizations have the capacity to act. And so we've been partnering with groups like the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies to really think about how to build toolkits, playbooks to enable that kind of information that would come maybe to a central point to get out into the hands of people who need to move, to perhaps secure their livelihood, to keep their families safe. And then interestingly, we have some really interesting pilots that we've been running mostly in Africa with Give Directly and International Rescue Committee, who are providing cash transfers in advance of these flooding events. And recently we've seen that people are able to make decisions about moving their livestock, to secure their food stores, to really change what they're doing with this better information because they not just have the information to act, but also some cash to help them to do that more effectively. So those are interesting early results, but we're excited about the possibility of combining some of these different elements. We know that community members are hugely impactful on the ground in these moments, and we need to be empowering them with that information too.
I think it's the same thing, but within the report, they call these crisis alerts. And I think they go through different climate impacts. And so that's what you were just talking about. So you have those that are generated for wildfires. And do those go out to, is the goal that community leaders, or it's actually in the hands of individuals that are just in their homes? What's the scale there?
Yeah, so it's a mix. So I was just speaking about the work that we've done on flooding, which is our most scaled up, I would say, analysis. We do have crisis alerts on all kinds of events. Not all of those are in advance, right? Some of those are things that are happening in the moment, and we're getting people information. So people are coming to Google often to get that information. We as a company obviously want to make sure that they have the best information that we can help surface, often from authorities, right? These are things that we do in partnership with government. For wildfires, we also have tools to really help us put out that timely wildfire information. And in 2023, we're able to get that into the hands of 30 million users across different 100 plus events. Now that is directly to users, as you said. But we are also, particularly through flooding, we have now a tool that if you Google it, you can find called Flood Hub, which provides that information. And we have partnerships with government and with the World Meteorological Organization around the world who are helping to get that information into the hands of not just citizens, but obviously government agencies and responders who can act.
Well, that was my next question. I was going to ask about the Flood Hub. Can you elaborate on that? And so are you guys in charge of that, or is it just a tool that empowers local people to plug in information? I'm trying to visualize it.
Yeah. So if you think about it as essentially a free AI tool that we've put out into the world as Google, and this is a project that's really driven by our Google research team. These are some of our leading AI scientists that brings in detailed flood mapping and warnings around the world. Again, trying to give us not just information about what's happening, but what we predict would potentially be happening, as I said, up to 7 days in advance, right? So those are catastrophic events in many cases. Now, it's not for everything. We are still working on things like coastal flooding, which is a more complex mathematical modeling question than riverine flooding, but it is something that we continue to map out. And so this is a place where people can get information displaying forecasts, as I said, for over 80 countries across the world, which covers almost 500 million people globally. So governments can be engaging there. It's open to anyone. We are collaborating with many modeling and forecasting scientists and communities around the world to continually bring that as part of a free and open project. And then, as I said, Google.org is really thinking, we as a philanthropy, how do we make sure that information not just is out there, but has impact for the most vulnerable groups who are often on the front lines of these flooding events And to do that, we know that we need to pair that kind of AI modeling with the work that happens on the ground, with folks who have been on the front lines of responding to these types of events for generations, really, and ensure that we marry up, right, that advanced technology with the things that we know work to help people be able to respond effectively.
We hear this a lot, that AI is playing a role, and you said that earlier. What does that really look like in this regard? AI can take many forms, and I'm just curious myself, what kind of, is it really under the hood, or it's things that people actually would understand that it's being used?
Most of the work that we've been doing in the climate space with AI, which we've been doing for 8-10 years now, and we've been supporting nonprofit organizations to do that work over the past 6 or 7 years, is really in the climate space in kind of 3 directions. So the first is in creating and generating new information, taking in the vast quantity of data that exists about our planet, about the environment, and being able to look for patterns in it that no human would potentially be able to see. So that's work like we're doing in support of Climate Trace, who's been using AI to model out all human-created global greenhouse gas emissions around the world in real time, a picture of greenhouse gas emissions that we haven't had before, right? Now that enables us obviously to hopefully take more action. And it's critically important that we have that kind of information also as we think about adaptation, as we understand what the impacts of the warming planet will be. And then we also have work, as I mentioned, in the prediction space, right? We can use AI to look at past patterns and take in data in real time to understand and better predict with both better accuracy and ideally with a greater amount of time before an event what might be happening. And then we also see a lot of AI in optimization, being able to better think about how we might route, for example, cars on the road such that we could reduce emissions, which we're doing actually through Google Maps, or looking at streetlights and idling, which can cause a lot of emissions, and thinking about if we can better optimize some of those systems, how might we be able to actually reduce emissions without really anyone having to change much of what they're doing. So those are some of the unlocks that we're excited about. I think in the adaptation space, one of the things that's so meaningful is just the need to really understand what's happening in nature and the way that interacts with what is happening from the human side of change that we're encountering. The work that World Wildlife Fund is doing in Mexico is such a great example of that, because it really is connecting this need to understand the ecosystem, the mangrove ecosystem in this case, with an ability to predict, right, what might more catastrophic events or different shifts in the coastal tide pattern or in the shoreline actually mean for these important ecosystems. And then similarly, how might we invest in those ecosystems such that we actually might use them as an adaptation tool? Those are the kinds of things, experiments that we might see take quite some time, right? And we would do them in isolation. We would rely a lot on human observation, which is often very unscalable. It's not possible for a person to sit and observe natural change in the same way that a combination of sensors and AI models really can. And I think that unlock is something that I just am so excited to see what we'll continue to do with. It is very different than the AI that we see talked about in the media today, right? This is not necessarily all powered by the same large language models that you're interacting with in a sort of more chatbot type structure. We are seeing how some of those generative tools might be useful, but a lot of this is really the kind of machine learning, deep learning approaches, extensions of the data science work that we've all been building on for decades now, really being embedded in new ways in climate work. And I think there's so much potential for what there is to come in addition to what we're already seeing out there today.
I had mentioned earlier that you guys have released an environmental report for 2024. Is that available to the public?
It is, yes. You can find it on the Google Sustainability site, or actually probably if you just Google Environmental Report, that is available and has great examples, as you alluded to, of some of the adaptation work that we're undertaking across a range of things. Too many to talk about in just one conversation.
And it was shared with me, and I'll make sure it's in my show notes for this episode. That's fantastic. All right. I have these adaptation planners that are my listeners at every scale: federal government, state government, local government. What would you recommend for individuals or even these communities that wanted to work with the tools that you guys have developed? Because some are already working with it, but what's really the best way for them to approach it and really use these things?
I think there's 2 categories of tools that I'd encourage folks to be engaging with. Some of the ones that I've mentioned that are really built by Google and out there, the Flood Hub is certainly one of the most robust, and I think you'll continue to see more things like that. We also do try to do that work in partnership. So ideally, we're continuing to find ways and channels to get those alerts into the things that planners are already using, right? Tools that are already available to them, such that we know that people are getting a lot coming at them, new technology, new opportunities. It's an extremely challenging time to be doing adaptation work and an extremely important time. And so want to make sure that we're finding ways to embed these things in practical applications. One of the tools that we have, which is mentioned in the environmental report, is our Environmental Insights Explorer tool. It's a tool that allows cities to look at their emissions patterns, but also things like tree canopy cover. And we're continually working to incorporate more of the data and information that we can glean from AI models on things like extreme heat, for example, rooftop cover, that hopefully can provide a more accessible way to get some of these pieces of information, these data points, in a packaged way for cities. And then that tool interacts with some of the tools that folks are already using. So yet another window into some of those that we will continue to be investing in, and we hope to create as a really helpful product for folks in that position. And then the second category of things I'd mention is just we as Google.org are supporting so many nonprofit partners who are building out great projects like the work that WWF is doing on ManglarIA, that some of that is more in the research realm. But for example, we've provided funding and support to WRI, who's doing a really incredible work right now on extreme heat, trying to both better understand extreme heat. How do we better model that? Highly important, especially today. We're recording this in the summer. It's been a very hot one. Thinking about what are the component pieces of that, and then using those models, importantly, to try to better understand what it could look like to mitigate extreme heat. And for cities that are experimenting with some of those measures, whether it be cool sidewalks or cool roofs or looking at tree cover, what is the understanding that we can have of how effective those might be? And then how do we take those experiments that some cities are doing to help inform what others might do? And then similarly, supporting an organization, a coalition of organizations led by New School, who are building a tool called Climate IQ, which is really focused on kind of urban climate hazard modeling, which is extremely hard just with so many interaction effects. So again, a bunch of organizations out there who are really trying to tackle this with us. And I think one of our deep beliefs is that by putting these AI tools in the hands of people who deeply care about and are connected to these issues, we will unlock new solutions. So I think the final thing I would say is that it is an opportunity to really lean in and try to work with these tools. Folks who are on the front lines of adaptation are going to know best what they need, and they're going to know best what solutions actually are feasible in the context in which they're operating. And all of that is an important feedback loop as we continue collectively as a global society, as an ecosystem here, to be focused on and prioritizing the most important things that are really going to move the needle on adaptation for all of us in the years to come.
I find that very exciting. I've been doing adaptation a long time, and all these tools that are coming online, as you said, as people take them for a test drive, I'm sure that's going to be incredibly useful to you. And I just can't even imagine 5 years from now where adaptation planning and tool work is going to be at. So that is very exciting. So Bridget, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing what you're doing.
Thank you so much for having me, Doug, and for lifting up these stories. I am also very excited about what we are embarking on as we think about incorporating AI into this work, and we need to do it quickly and more than ever. So excited for folks to continue to join in.
All right, guys, we're back with Sean Martin of WWF, and he's going to give us some background on the next section of this podcast and our visit to Mexico. Hey, Sean.
Hey, Doug.
Sean, we just got grounded in AI and some of the cool work Google.org is doing. And so the exciting part here is we went to Mexico. So where did we go and why that location?
Yes, we went to the Yucatán Peninsula, specifically the Rio Lagartos Biosphere Reserve, and we visited 2 communities there. And it was exciting for me because we had just installed some of the sensors that we needed for this project. And we were going out into the field to look at these sensors, weather stations, motion sensitive cameras, or what we call camera traps, and some of the other technology that's out there, drones that we're using. And we got to see how these things were functioning in the wild and talk to some of the community members that are participating in the project.
This was fantastic talking to these people. It was a really rich experience for me. So why did you guys select these community members?
These are partners that WWF have been working with in the community for some time, and we have good relationships with them. They do all kinds of things for their livelihoods, but at heart, they're all conservationists. And so we thought it was very important to involve them in the project. Many of them received weather stations, and we're going to hear from a few of them. There are many others, but we're going to hear from someone who owns and operates a hotel, the one where we stayed at, and has a tourism business, and then a man who grows honey in mangrove ecosystems, and we got to taste the honey, which was really cool. And then we also talked to a guy who's a conservationist, but also a fisherman, and we learned about how the fishing livelihoods are being affected by climate change in Rio Lagartos.
Obviously, this trip is behind us, but can you briefly describe what happened on the field trips? Because I like my listeners to feel like they're there with me and I get to go to these cool places. And yeah, what did we do? We took a couple of boat trips, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't call Rio Lagartos a cool place. It was really hot.
Yeah,
and humid. But yes, we were out in boats. You leave the communities, Rio Lagartos, you take probably like a 45-minute hour boat ride out to the mangroves, the places where we installed weather stations, and you get out of the boat and you carefully walk through the mangroves, it's like walking through mud knee deep over big root systems, and it branches in your face, and then you get to a little clearing, and there you will find a weather station. And I think on the show notes, we'll post a picture of that weather station so your listeners can see what we got to see. The other thing that was really cool is we got to see some wildlife. We saw crocodiles and lots of flamingos, which the area is famous for. And you'll hear later some of the animals that we didn't see in person, but that we saw through the camera traps that we installed in Rio Lagartos.
Yeah, I just want to say that these boat trips were awesome. And yes, we had to hop out waist deep. And I'm actually going in this mud in my Tevas, but it worked out just fine. And yes, crocodiles were around, but I actually did some of the interviews there on site, which is really cool. We can do in the field to do those kind of things. And so I want to describe it. It was such a beautiful area, and the boat rides were nice and just pristine mangrove forest. And obviously they need to do some restoration in some areas, but yeah, just a fantastic area. All right, let's pivot here a little bit, Sean. And so we're doing something pretty unusual with this podcast episode. In fact, what we're doing here is the first time I've ever done this. We are using AI for the interviews. Can you explain what we're doing?
Yeah, this is really cool, and I'm glad you agreed to experiment with it. So the community members that we met with aren't English speakers, and neither you or I are Spanish speakers. So we had our staff like Frida, Gonzalo, and Ninel ask questions to the community members that we spoke to, but we didn't really understand what they were saying. And of course, we didn't know how your listeners would be able to understand them either. So we had the idea that we could use this new software to translate the Spanish into English, not just text, but the actual voice. And so what you'll hear is the results of that, I would say, experiment with AI. So we speak to 3 community members in Spanish and Gonzalo, our staff member, and you'll get to hear the responses to your questions in English. The voices will sound a little clunky and robotic. They're actually real persons. But we were really impressed with the accuracy of the translations, even if the voices sound a little bit off. So that was really cool. And what was it like for you doing this experiment with AI and translation?
To be quite honest, and first off, I just want to help my listeners visualize. So I would be sitting there next to
standing knee deep in mud,
but the WWF staff like Frida, I would ask the question in English. Frida would ask the question in Spanish, and then the community member would answer. And in one of them, we were in the backyard of the beekeeper, and parrots were squawking in the background. It was really just a cool process, and it really worked out. But regarding the AI, I was a little nervous when you first suggested this. I'm like, Sean, you're nuts. We're not going to be able to do this. The technology's not quite there yet, but I came back and I was able to process it through, and I'm using AI in my production process, even in other episodes. And the translations were really good. And we shared those with Spanish speakers, and they worked out well. And yes, they sound a little bit robotic, but they give you the information, and it's very exciting. And there was some trial and error. I think the first one I sent you, I had an Australian accent, and we thought maybe we shouldn't use an Australian accent. It wasn't working. So we tweaked it a little bit, but relatively happy with what we have here. Yeah, it was exciting for me to do something different. I think we still have a long ways to go, but you're still getting great content out of this. Sean, let's not wait any longer. Let's hear from these folks from Mexico.
Great.
Hey everybody, I am here with
Alejandra Calzada from WWF Mexico.
What do you do with WWF?
I'm with the climate adaptation team.
Okay, so there's an interesting history to the name of this project. Can you tell us that?
Yeah, so when we first pitched the project to Google, I think we had another name. I think it was Smart Parks. But then Google came back to us saying that there was already another project with the same name and that we had to come up with a new one. Some of our team members had pitched a few ideas. They said, I think we were playing around with the words climate and parks and climate smart. Maybe mangroves were there. I was bothered by two things. One is none of those names were in English. In Spanish, we need a name in Spanish. And also the word parks didn't resonate with me because parks, we don't use the word parks as much in Mexico. It's more reserves or protected areas. So I went to a chatbot because I couldn't come up with a name myself. I was just trying to break my head and really come up with a name, but I just couldn't find one. So I went to a chatbot and I said, hey, can you please help me with a name with a project? And I can't remember which other ideas it's pitched to me, but ManglarIA was one of them. And it's manglar is mangrove in Spanish. IA is AI in Spanish, so ManglarIA. And so I talked with a couple of our colleagues and I said, do you like any of these options? And she said, yeah, this is great. And it would read like this, ManglarIA, as opposed to ManglarIA. But yes, that's the story of the name.
Seems appropriate for the project, though, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Doc.
Who are you?
Gonzalo Sanson, oficial de Adaptation.
Gonzalo Sanson, Coastal Ecosystems Adaptation Officer. I am the coordinator of the Mangla project. I like to see myself a bit as the orchestrator of activities. We need to ensure that all field teams have what they need. We also need to oversee and make agreements with partners to ensure that the entire project, all its components, go well.
You have an interesting background. Can you just tell us a little bit more about yourself, your academic background, your sort of professional background?
Yes, of course. I have a bachelor's degree in geophysical engineering, and while from my professional experience before joining the Mangla project, I was a sustainability consultant. We did mostly the evaluation of contaminated sites. We did sampling, installed wells, took soil and water samples, and monitored flora and fauna. So my experience complements each component of the project a little bit.
Describe where we're at really quickly and what we're hearing in the background.
We are in an area approximately, I think, about 60 kilometers east of El Cuyo. It's a zone within the protected natural area. It's a very rarely visited area where the mangroves are in good condition. We entered through the mouth of the estuary, and in the background we can hear the boatmen waiting for us, and of course they have some music to pass the time.
You had a big role in getting all the equipment that was so important for this project, right?
Yes, we are working with the global science and technology team in the United States and with local partners to define exactly which variables we need, what equipment can measure those variables, and where is it necessary to set up the equipment to get accurate measurements that can answer the research questions.
Okay, so now that you have a lot of the equipment and it's out in the field, have you discovered that there's things that you're missing or you might do differently with the equipment you've purchased?
It depends a lot on the nature of the equipment. We want most of them to be able to transmit remotely, and within the entire range of equipment, only certain providers can do this. But there comes a challenge to overcome, which is ensuring there is a signal to transmit and that the antennas are powerful enough to connect to the network. Since we are in a remote location, as you can see, the main challenge is the placement of the equipment to ensure a good signal, accessibility, and that it is also safe for everyone.
So what type of equipment are you buying to collect this data, and how many of those pieces of equipment are you buying?
So we are going to have approximately 14 monitoring sites here in the Rio Lagardos Reserve. At each monitoring site, there will be a cluster of sensors. We plan to install equipment to measure meteorological variables with weather stations that provide us with approximately 11 to 12 variables. These include humidity, precipitation, temperature, ultraviolet radiation, photosynthetically active radiation, among others. We also want to complement the meteorological information with hydrological data. For that, we already have a good set from data loggers that measure conductivity, temperature, and by measuring the pressure of the water column. They can estimate fluctuations in water levels, both surface and aquifer levels. These measurements are complementary to the meteorological variables. And we are using two types of cameras, conventional terrestrial cameras that can be programmed to activate when they detect movement, and submersible cameras that we want to install underwater. These cameras can also be programmed to detect movement. And with these two sets of cameras, we want to observe biodiversity, which species pass by. We are also installing, and this is important, a flux tower here in the Rio Lagartos Reserve. This carbon flux tower consists of a set of approximately 10 sensors. These independent sensors combine to measure essentially one thing: the exchange of CO2 between the atmosphere and the ecosystem. So, in addition to these devices that will be installed in the field, which are fixed or stationary sensors, we also want to use some remote sensing equipment, such as drone flights, to capture multispectral images and conduct a LiDAR survey to obtain the forest structure. And finally, we are also using multispectral satellite images.
During this interview, a praying mantis crawled on my microphone. Is that normal?
In these types of places, it's the least you can expect.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, can you introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Frida Castillo, and I am an environmental scientist. I also did a master's degree in ecosystem restoration. I am currently working as a field officer in WWF, and I am part of the project ManglarIA that is taking place here in Rio Lagartos on the field, like the installation of sensors and the workshops with communities and all the work that is taking place here in Rio Lagartos.
It's hot and humid, and I'm looking outside. I see a lot of boats, and I see mangroves. Where are we right now?
We are in the Biosphere Reserve of Rio Lagartos, that is in the north of Yucatán.
Can you tell me a bit more about working on this project in the area?
Yeah, we have been working in this area since 5 years ago with other projects. One of them is Costas Listas, that was focused on the coast, and then the project Raíces, that it was focused on mangrove restoration and other environmental problems here in the reserve. And now we are currently working here as a ManglarIA project that we want to know how climate change affects mangroves.
What has stood out for you personally working on this project?
What I enjoy the most about this project is being able to be in the mangroves and be able to create data that can help mangroves against climate change, and to know how this is going to affect the communities that live here and that they are related with the environmental services.
You're using AI in this project. Sometimes that's a challenge to communicate. Have you had your own challenges talking to local community members about AI?
Yeah, we have some problems talking about AI because I think it's a new topic. And we are discovering ways to communicate how we can use AI to understand better the mangroves and the environment.
Okay, we're staying in this wonderful hotel. Who will we be speaking with first?
Elena Conde, she is the owner of the hotel, and she also do environmental education with kids, and she's also really aware of the environment because she goes to do environmental photography.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Can you please introduce yourself?
Soy Elena Conde, tengo 21 años viviendo en Rio Lagartos.
I'm Elena Conde, and I've been living in Rio Lagartos for 21 years. I never thought I would live in the port, much less within the reserve, during my time here at the hotel. I've taken on new activities that I never imagined I would do. I'm a nature photographer and a bird watcher, and I'm always in favor of conservation. I'm from Chiapas. Moving here has truly been a radical change in my life, especially in the activities we do. Honestly, I never thought I would manage a hotel, much less enjoy living here in Rio Lagartos so much.
Have you noticed any changes in the weather since you've lived here?
Yes, a lot. For example, the temperature has been too high and we have more hurricane seasons. Before, I think it was 3 months, and now we have 4 months of hurricanes. So the climate has changed a lot. When I first arrived here, you didn't hear much about hurricanes, but now, We have more rainfall each season as the dangerous season approaches. Yes, it's very concerning because everything has changed from the climate to fishing, and overall biodiversity here has changed throughout the peninsula. For example, lobster fishing. Before, when it was lobster season, it was really lobster season because the catch was abundant. The same goes for octopus season. I think over all this time, what has also greatly affected fishing is the overfishing of sea cucumbers. It's like it broke a cycle because we no longer have as many other products or fish. So really, today Rio Lagartos is living off of, well, before it depended 100% on fishing, but now Rio Lagartos depends on tourism. So everything has changed as well.
So how have these changes affected your life here and your business?
Well, for example, in the tourism sector, there were 2 or 3 years when we almost didn't have flamingos because they migrated due to the rains to another area. And well, our main activity, the most popular tour in all of Lagartos, is the flamingo tour. So yes, it did decline a bit, but now we are getting back on track. Fortunately, this year there was flooding and we tagged 300 flamingos. So yes, it has changed. But we are trying to ensure that this change is reflected in new tourist activities in a different way.
So you've received a weather station. Why did you agree to do this?
Well, I'm really interested in the weather because it's super important for everything, not just for our clients to see how the activity will go, but also for planning our outings. Bird watching too, so that when a client arrives, we can be more certain if it's going to rain or not, to plan many tourist activities and to really know how things will be.
So how could you see using this information?
Well, I use it personally to keep track of how the climate is changing for us. The weather here is very important, especially for me as a bird watcher, because it helps me plan better. And since I also have a group of children that I teach bird watching to, I think it's very important for them as well. Stay informed. How this climate change mainly affects us where we live and everything that can gradually change.
Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you.
Can you please introduce yourself?
Mi nombre es Manuel Maro Rosado. Soy guía de turismo.
My name is Manuel Maro Rosado. I am a tour guide, and I also have an alternative job as a beekeeper.
How long have you lived in the area?
I am 53 years old, and I was born here and have lived here my whole life.
Have you noticed things that have changed with the weather?
A lot. Before we could predict the weather just by looking at the clouds or the movement of some birds or something like that. Now it's very difficult because you see it's a natural forecast and suddenly it doesn't come or there's too much sun or excessive rain. Now we need technology to know.
How have these changes with the climate affected your life and your business?
For example, in the matter of beekeeping, we used to have a rain calendar that allowed us to predict when it would rain, so we could schedule harvests or the division or increase of hives. Now you wait for the rain, and suddenly it's sunny.
You've agreed to accept one of the weather stations. Why did you do that?
I like meteorology. I've always been researching the weather. We used to do it based on what our parents told us, like, hey, this type of cloud forms this way, and it will rain the next day. The rings around the moon are a sign of rain, and now I'm into technology.
So what do you think you might do with that information?
Well, in this case, as you already know, I'm a guide, right? Now I have an alternative to being a fisherman. It helps me know when it's going to rain, we can go fishing or not.
Can you tell us a bit about the process of beekeeping in the mangrove forest?
Yes, of course. We started with the Apis mellifera in terms of multiflora, and suddenly we had the great idea to put it in the mangrove to see what type of honey they produce, and we discovered that the black mangrove, the red mangrove, they produce honey. It's totally different. The taste of the multiflora compared to the mangrove has a taste like a sweet, salty, and this.
And then we became guides and received a great explanation about the importance of bees in the mangroves And now, with a group managed by Claudia, we are trying to place many hives in the mangroves to help with pollination.
Why did you get started doing this?
Well, my mom used to buy wax and make candles, handmade candles, and she couldn't get wax anymore, so she asked me if I could get some from the neighbor. I went to the neighbor and he said, "Why don't you get into it and produce it yourself?" So he gave me a great idea, and my neighbor taught me about beekeeping 18 years ago. And now, yes, I know what wax is. I know what honey is. I know the whole process to make a candle.
Thank you very much for participating, and thanks for joining the podcast.
Thank you.
Can you tell us who you are?
Hola, mi nombre es Gamaliel Maldonado. Soy originario del Puerto del Cuyo.
Hello, my name is Gamel Maldonado. I'm from Puerto del Cuyo, and I'm 33 years old. My hobbies are nature-related activities. I also work a bit in waste management in my community, a project focused on the environment. I work in the fishing sector, specifically in the diving area, fish and lobster catch.
Can you tell us a bit more about being a fisherman in the area?
If the fishing sector has seen a slight decline in catches over the past 10 years, we've noticed changes in certain species that were very abundant about 20 years ago. Fishing was economically viable. In the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen drastic changes. Year by year, it has decreased. The fishing sector has declined significantly.
Have you noticed anything changing with the weather or the climate since you've lived here?
Yes, I have noticed changes in the tides. The tides and currents have been taking longer to arrive, affecting the new biomass or species that we had been monitoring year after year. We knew that species would reach the coast, but not in recent years. I repeat, in the last 10 years, the currents have taken longer to reach our area. Now, colder water currents come in. Sometimes the warm waters are delayed. But I have noticed the change in the currents around the port. We have seen drastic changes in the last 7 or 8 years.
Do you ever talk about the climate or the weather with other fishermen in the area?
Yes, the truth is that we have shared what we have observed, because with what we can see, we talk and don't have clear answers at the moment. At least for me, personally, I like to investigate or be involved with people who know about the topic. But yes, we have talked with the fishermen, and they do notice the changes. They see it. You no longer feel that hope of saying that next year will be better. On the contrary, now it's more about accepting the coming year and how the fishing season will start.
You've agreed to put a weather station up on your property. Can you tell us why?
Yes, of course, I accept having the weather station at my home because I like being involved in the climate sector. My job requires monitoring winds, tides, and water currents. We don't have technology that we use with navigation apps, but having this data at home year after year is beneficial. Well, being able to create a graph and share those experiences or real numbers with my colleagues, and they can see how we have changes within our area, in our beaches and coasts. So for me, it's important to monitor day by day, month by month, year by year, and to share this message with my community and the fishermen.
So how has this experience been working with World Wildlife Fund?
My experience with WWF? Well, to start, I want to thank them for inviting me to the initial talks and workshops that have been held here in the community. I had heard of the organization for a while, but I hadn't worked directly with them, with my colleague Frida and the others, and Gonzalo. And now that we have worked a bit directly with them, I am grateful for everything they bring to my community, and what I am learning from them, and that passion they have for the climate and for monitoring these communities. They are a very, very beautiful port, right? But what they bring, the message and other people who can help us share how to continue preserving these areas with this organization, I am super happy that they are here in the port.
Can you tell us about our boat trip today, and did your boat get stuck?
Yes, well, today's adventure, the overall journey was excellent. These are trips that I enjoy every time I go out, right? Sometimes activities bring about experiences or situations that aren't planned, but they are situations that are not dangerous, situations that can be resolved, and we can continue sailing without any problem. But they are experiences that come up. Even though I've been sailing my whole life, there's always some little hiccup here and there, but up to this day, there's been no danger.
Okay, what's your favorite fish to catch?
My favorite catch is grouper, snapper, and lobster, which I didn't mention earlier in the context of fishing, but grouper, snapper, and lobster are some of my favorites to catch and eat as well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
So I'm here to discuss some of the wildlife photos that we got captured on the trail cam. Okay, I'm with Frida. Frida, tell us a bit about what we're seeing.
Hi, Docs. Yeah, so we just arrived from our field trip and we took the camera traps, the easy cars, and we were looking at them and we found a fog, we found raccoons, we also found different species of garzas. And the interesting part here is that we found garza who is protected here in Mexico. So I think this is how we can communicate why mangroves are important to conserve and preserve because of the biodiversity that is in there.
So we're flipping through these photos right now, and I'm seeing some really cool stuff. Were there any surprises when you got this first batch?
Yeah, because the first time we were installing the camera traps, we were wondering if we will be able to find terrestrial animals because it was in a place surrounded by water. So we were thinking about how animals can distribute by this area, but finding small mammals, there is a sign that we can find different species. It's just a matter of time.
Okay, also joining us is
Dave Bao with the World Wildlife Fund.
So you've seen some of these images. What do you think? What are you guys going to do with these things?
The images were amazing, and the camera traps haven't been out there for that long. Eventually, we're going to have a lot of images, and it's going to take a long time to go through them. So we're going to start using AI to analyze which images have which species and which images have nothing in them and which ones have people that we shouldn't be paying attention to.
All right, I'm also here with Sean Martin of World Wildlife Fund. Sean, any early thoughts on what we're seeing here?
It's just really good to see. I was excited like everybody else to just see what's out there. We were in the mangroves for 3 days and we saw some birds, but like crocodiles, but nothing like what we're seeing on the camera. So it's just good to know that stuff is out there that we can't see. And now we have a way to find out what's out there.
So any other thoughts? You're going to get a lot of wildlife photos as this camera's out there. And, you know, are you going to be sharing this information with other folks? Because I'm sure it's kind of valuable wildlife to check in.
Yeah, we will share the photos.
So what else are you hoping to see with these cameras?
We want to see some jaguars and another bigger mammals there. But also it was interesting because we saw little bears feeding with fishes. We saw that the importance of mangrove is also because there are species there who are important for another species.
And Thao, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, another nice thing about the tools we'll be using is we'll be able to analyze data across multiple camera traps. So, for instance, we're going to be using something called Wildlife Insights, which is a collaboration with a bunch of NGOs and Google to apply AI to camera trap images. And it has the ability to analyze activities of species when they're active within a given camera trap, but also across deployments, which species are active where and how many. And we can see change over time as we analyze the imagery over the years that we'll be working on the project.
And Frida, anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that for me, I was really excited to see this because you can some way see how the species behaves because, you know, I saw the bird just cleaning their wings and the raccoons there with another raccoons. And there is some way how we can discover how animals behave in mangroves.
And Sean?
I also, being a climate guy, we're really excited looking at the data with those images. You'll see that there are temperature and barometric pressure as well as date and time. And so now we know we can see when these animals come out. If it's too hot, will they come out? And this is the kind of stuff we want to learn by capturing weather data along with camera trap data.
Okay, here's hoping we'll see a jaguar sometime soon on those cameras. Thanks. Sean is back here at the end of the episode to wrap things up. So we heard from your team and partners in Mexico. How is the project going right now, and what are you learning so far?
The project's going great. We are starting to collect data, and Thao and his team are setting up the algorithms that we need to start analyzing the data. One of the early things we're going to do is look at what we call temperature envelopes. That is, at what temperatures we see species, or in what temperatures do we stop seeing species. So we saw a fox in the mangroves on the camera traps, and now we know what time that fox appeared, but now we also know the temperature at that date and time. And so we can start pairing that data when we saw the fox and how hot it was, and what's the minimum temperature that we see foxes and what's the maximum temperature we see foxes. And that's really important for conservation because species all have thresholds that they will not be able to survive once it gets too hot. And we need to know that to help conserve them. What we're learning so far, even though we don't have any results from the data analysis, and I already knew this, but mangroves are really complex ecosystems, and we're working with a lot of partners who have different research interests. Some people are interested in the carbon. Some people are interested in the biodiversity, the microbiomes in the soil, you name it. There's somebody's researching it. So we have a lot of people studying different things in lots of disciplines: data scientists, computer scientists, engineers, biologists, ecologists, carbon scientists, and they all have their own research questions that they want to prioritize. And because mangroves are such complex ecosystems, we went down lots of rabbit holes trying to determine what variables we would look at for the research. And we finally came to consensus. We picked some easy ones like the camera trap and weather data that I mentioned to get us started. And as we learn more, we'll be able to ask more complex research questions in the future.
As I was there and I was hearing the conversations with the Mexico WWF staff, there's a lot of complex things that they're doing. So are they enjoying this project? Because I'm sure it's much different from a lot of things they've done before.
They're loving it. And I think for lots of people who work at WWF, it's really their dream job. We're doing what we love and things that we deeply care about, whether it's climate change or biodiversity conservation or helping people in local communities. And WWF brings all that together in the work that we do. And I would say that people are really happy and excited about this project.
You and I both saw some of these tools and tech in action when we were down there. Could you talk about some of the biggest challenges in deploying this tech in remote ecosystems like mangroves?
Yeah, so they are very remote locations. Like I said earlier, it took an hour to get from the community, Rio Lagartos, the town, to some of the sites. And we have to haul that equipment out there. And then a thing like a weather station, which is probably like 15 feet tall, you're carrying that equipment through mud and really dense forest to get to a clearing. The company that we're purchasing the weather stations from, it was a unique experience for them. They hadn't quite anticipated how difficult it would be to install those weather stations. And then there are issues with the weather stations that the community members own. We learned that the power often goes out, and every time the power goes out, the weather station stops working, and then it has to be recalibrated every time they start it up again. So there's hiccups like that, but those challenges are not large enough to negate the enthusiasm that people have for participating in the project.
Yeah, and I just like to say, every time Frida would take the drone up, and she was really good at it, it would have to come down, and sometimes it'd have to land on the boat, these small boats that we were on, and the landing strip area was probably like 3 feet across. And so I think that one time she landed it, we all cheered, so that was fun to see.
She was a master drone operator for sure.
Sean, so what's next for the ManglarIA project?
So we have 2 more years to collect and analyze the data. The project, though, will last a long time beyond those 2 years. And we're working with our partners to set up a system so that the research can continue after that. At the end of the project, we are going to make all the data available to anyone who wants to use it for their own research, whether it's related to climate change or not. And then we want to take what we learn from this project and then replicate it in other ecosystems all over the world. So we're really looking forward to the future and what we learn from this project. And I hope to give you an update when we're all done.
Sean, before we wrap this up, did you have a favorite moment on any of our mangrove field trips?
For me, it was when we took the boat trip from El Cuyo, another little town in the reserve, through the mangrove ecosystems. And the weather was gorgeous and the water was like the bluest blue you've ever seen. And the mangroves were really cool. And I just love being on the boat and just taking in all the beauty of the area.
Yeah, in some of the places that we stopped, we took some trails really deep into the mangrove forest, and we came to a spring, and in two different springs actually where crocodiles were just floating, and the water was crystal clear, and you could just see their whole bodies. And yeah, they didn't care that we were there. They were beautiful creatures, and so that certainly was my favorite moment. I love a good crocodile. All right, Sean, before we wrap up, what can people do to support mangrove conservation, even if they're not directly involved with technology that we've talked about or conservation?
I'm glad you asked that question. People probably wouldn't think about what they could do for mangrove conservation. Of course, you can donate to conservation organizations like WWF, but there's other things you can do. Many people take vacations in countries like Mexico, and they like to stay on the coast. And I think it's important that you research where you're staying. There are a lot of hotels and resorts that keep the mangrove ecosystems intact. And there are others that clear them to build hotels and resorts. And so I think it's really important to support those businesses that are preserving the mangroves. Also, people traveling to the area, you wouldn't necessarily think to go to a place like Rio Lagartos in the Yucatan. People go to Cancun or Chichen Itza, which is the Mayan archaeological site. But these people and these mangrove ecosystems really depend on tourists coming to visit them. And so take a little bit of more time, go to a place like Rio Lagartos or El Cuyo and go see the mangroves. You're helping support the local economy there and indirectly supporting mangrove conservation.
Sean, it was such a treat to work with you on this project. Thanks for partnering with America Adapts and all the great work you're doing at WWF.
It's always a pleasure, Doug. Thank you.
Okay, Adapters, that is a wrap. Thanks to everyone who participated in this episode. What an adventure. The Yucatan is beautiful, and it was an honor and privilege to partner with WWF on this episode. Adaptation is emerging quickly, and thought leaders like WWF are doing some really innovative work in this space. We need more nature-based approaches to adaptation, especially as more areas in the built environment start thinking about adaptation. And it's exciting to see WWF use artificial intelligence to benefit conservation in critically important mangrove forests. As you've learned in this pod, they are a unique ecosystem with truly unique attributes to help coastal areas adapt to a changing climate. They will only become more important in the years ahead, and WWF's work will help current and future planners think about how we protect these magnificent ecosystems. If you want to learn more, check out the show notes. There's even a link to one of the sensors that was set up in the mangrove forest. It was very cool to see it in person and learn what information it's producing. These are remote areas that see very harsh weather conditions, so data collection can be a challenge. Okay, finally, thanks again to Sean Martin and to WWF for partnering with America Adapts. It's always a pleasure working with Sean and the team at WWF. Okay, Adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.